The city buzzed with life, cars honking, people rushing, the usual chaos of a busy downtown. In the middle of it all stood a small, modest diner called Sonny's Corner. It wasn't fancy, but it had a warmth to it, the kind of place where regulars came for the comfort food and friendly faces. Inside, a waitress in her late 20s moved quickly between tables, balancing trays with practiced ease. She had a tired but kind smile, the kind that made customers feel at home. Life hadn't been easy for her, she worked long hours, barely making ends meet, but she never let it show. To her, every customer deserved kindness, no matter what. Meanwhile, in a sleek high-rise office across town, a man sat behind a large desk, staring at reports. He was the CEO of a well-known restaurant chain, a man used to luxury and respect. But lately, something had been bothering him. He had built his empire on the idea of customer service above all, but rumors had reached him. Some of his employees, especially in lower-tier locations, weren't treating people right. He needed to see for himself. Not as the boss, but as an ordinary person. That's when the idea hit him. The next morning, the CEO stood in front of a mirror, barely recognizing himself. Gone were the tailored suits and polished shoes. Instead, he wore worn-out jeans, a faded shirt, and a cap pulled low over his face. A bit of makeup added shadows under his eyes, making him look like he hadn't slept in days. He looked like any other struggling man trying to get by. His plan was simple: visit one of his own restaurants in disguise and see how he was treated. But as he walked past Sonny's Corner, something made him pause. The smell of fresh coffee and pancakes drifted through the door. It wasn't one of his places, but maybe that was better. A neutral test. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The diner was half full, the hum of quiet conversations filling the air. He chose a corner booth, keeping his head down. A few customers glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with indifference. He could feel their eyes, judging, maybe even uncomfortable. Then, the waitress approached. Unlike the others, her expression didn't change. No judgment, no hesitation. Just a warm smile. "Morning. Coffee?" she asked, her voice cheerful despite the early hour. He nodded, keeping his voice low. "Yes, please." She returned quickly, placing the cup in front of him. "Long night?" He hesitated. "Something like that." She didn't pry, just gave a small nod. "Well, the coffee's strong. Should help." As she walked away, the CEO watched her. No fake politeness, no forced smiles. Just genuine kindness. And that's when he noticed something else. A few minutes later, an elderly man walked in, his clothes ragged, his hands shaky. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, some even whispering. But the waitress? She greeted him like an old friend. "Your usual, right?" she said, already pouring his coffee. The man nodded gratefully, pulling out a handful of loose change. The CEO saw her wave it off. "Don't worry about it today. You can get me next time." The old man's eyes watered, but before he could say anything, she was already heading to another table, still smiling. The CEO sat there, stunned. This wasn't just good service. This was real, selfless kindness. And it left him with a heavy question: how many of his own employees would do the same? The CEO stirred his coffee slowly, lost in thought. He had expected to see indifference or even rudeness. After all, he had dressed himself to look like a man down on his luck. But this waitress? She treated him no differently than anyone else. His eyes followed her as she moved between tables, refilling cups, laughing with regulars, even wiping down a spill without complaint. There was something about her, an unshakable patience, a quiet strength. He wondered what her story was. The waitress, meanwhile, didn't have time to wonder about the quiet man in the corner. Her shift had started before sunrise, and she still had hours to go. Between orders, she stole glances at the clock. If she hurried, she could make it to her second job on time. Life wasn't easy, but she had learned to keep moving. Her apartment was small, the rent barely affordable, and some months, she had to choose between groceries and electricity. But she never complained, not to the customers, not even to herself. She had seen worse. A sudden crash snapped her back to the present. A customer had knocked over a glass, sending water across the floor. "I'm so sorry," the man stammered, embarrassed. She was already grabbing a towel. "No worries," she said, kneeling to clean it up. "Happens all the time." The CEO watched as she handled the mess without a single sigh or eye roll. Just acceptance. How many of his managers would react that way? Back in his office later that day, the CEO couldn't shake what he had seen. He had spent years building his business, focusing on profit margins and customer satisfaction surveys. But that waitress didn't need surveys to know how to treat people. She just did it. He pulled up the employee records for his own restaurants, scrolling through names and performance reviews. Everything looked perfect on paper. But was it real? A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, the quarterly reports are ready," his assistant said. He barely glanced at them. Later. There was something more important he needed to do. The next morning, the CEO returned to Sunny's corner, still in his disguise. This time, he took a seat at the counter, closer to the action. The waitress recognized him instantly. "Back again? Tough week?" He shrugged. "You could say that." She slid a menu toward him. "Well, the special today's pretty good. Homemade chili." He wasn't really hungry, but he nodded. "I'll take it." As she walked away, he noticed the way she interacted with the cook, friendly, but firm when she needed to be. No power struggles, no attitude. Just teamwork. His own kitchens could learn a thing or two. When she returned with his food, he decided to test her a little. "Mind if I ask you something?" he said, keeping his voice low. She paused. "Sure, what's up? Why do you work here?" She blinked, caught off guard. Then she laughed softly. "Bills don't pay themselves." "But you're good at this," he pressed. "Really good. Ever think about working somewhere fancier?" She wiped her hands on her apron, thinking. "I've had offers. But places like this? They're where people need kindness the most." The CEO felt a strange pang in his chest. Before he could respond, a loud voice cut through the diner. "Hey! This coffee's cold." A well-dressed man at a nearby table scowled, holding up his cup like it was a crime. The waitress didn't flinch. "I'll get you a fresh one right away." The man huffed. "About time." The CEO clenched his jaw. He had seen customers like that in his own restaurants, entitled, rude. And how did his staff handle them? With forced smiles, but frustration underneath. But the waitress? She came back with not just a new coffee, but a small pastry on the side. "On the house," she said lightly. "Sorry about the wait." The man looked surprised, then slightly ashamed. He muttered a thanks. The CEO stared. She had just turned an angry customer into a quiet one. Without arguing. Without groveling. How? As he left the diner that day, his mind raced. He had built an empire on systems, training programs, and incentives. But this woman had none of that, just instinct, empathy, and a heart that hadn't been hardened by life. He needed to talk to her again. Really talk. But next time, he wouldn't be in disguise. The CEO spent the next few days torn between his corporate responsibilities and the growing urge to return to Sunny's corner. He couldn't stop thinking about the waitress, her patience, her quiet strength, the way she handled difficult customers without losing her warmth. Finally, he made a decision. It was time to go back, but this time, as himself. The waitress had just finished her morning shift when she noticed a sleek black car pull up outside the diner. Unusual for this part of town. She watched as a man in an expensive suit stepped out, his posture confident, his eyes scanning the diner's entrance like he was assessing it. Her stomach dropped. Inspector? Corporate? She quickly smoothed her apron and checked her reflection in the coffee machine. Whatever this was about, she couldn't afford to lose this job. The bell above the door chimed as the man walked in. The diner fell quiet for a second, customers glancing up, sensing the shift in energy. Then, to her shock, he walked straight toward her. "You," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'd like to speak with you." She swallowed hard. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not here. Somewhere private." Her mind raced. Had she done something wrong? Forgotten an order? Been too slow? The cook, noticing her panic, stepped forward. "Hey, buddy, you got a problem?" The man in the suit held up a hand. "No problem. Just a conversation." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to her. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly. Then she read it. And her breath caught. CEO, Urban Eats Restaurant Group. Her eyes snapped back to his face, and that's when she recognized him. The scruffy clothes were gone, the tired slouch replaced by perfect posture. But the eyes? They were the same. The quiet man from the corner booth. The CEO watched as realization dawned on her face. Shock. Confusion. Then, worry. I don't understand," she said quietly. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "And an apology. The diner was too public for this." He gestured toward the door. "There's a cafe down the street. 5 minutes of your time. That's all I ask." She hesitated. This could be a trick. A scam. Or worse. But something in his expression, the same quiet sincerity she'd seen when he was pretending to be down on his luck, made her nod. "Okay. 5 minutes." The cafe was quiet, upscale. Nothing like Sunny's Corner. She sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, bracing for whatever came next. He didn't waste time. "I've been coming to your diner for days," he admitted. "In disguise. To see how you treated customers, especially those who looked like they had nothing." Her eyes widened. "You were testing me?" "Yes. And you passed in ways I never expected." She stiffened. "So this is some kind of corporate spy thing?" "No." He leaned forward. "It's a wake-up call. For me." He told her everything, the rumors about poor service in his restaurants, his frustration with employees who treated customers as transactions, not people. "And then there's you," he said, shaking his head. "You treat everyone with respect. Even the rude ones. Even when you're exhausted. That's the kind of service I've been trying to build for years." She didn't know what to say. This was too surreal. "So, what now?" she asked carefully. He took a deep breath. "Now, I'd like to offer you a job." The waitress stared at the CEO, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup. A job offer? After days of secretly watching her? This didn't feel real. "What kind of job?" she asked cautiously. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "Training manager. You'd teach my staff how to treat customers, the way you do." She almost laughed. Her? Training fancy restaurant employees? "I've never managed anyone in my life," she said. "That's exactly why I want you," he replied. You don't follow scripts. You don't fake kindness. You live it. Her chest tightened. The idea was terrifying, but also tempting. Meanwhile, back at Sunny's corner, the cook paced behind the counter. "Where'd she go with that suit?" he muttered to a regular. The customer shrugged. "Looked important. Maybe a health inspector?" The cook scowled. If that guy got her in trouble over some stupid rule, he'd. The bell jingled. Everyone turned. The waitress walked back in, her face unreadable. "Well?" the cook demanded. She opened her mouth, then closed it. How could she explain what just happened? "He offered me a job." That night, in her tiny apartment, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the business card. The salary he'd mentioned was triple what she made now. Health insurance. Paid leave. Things she'd only heard about in movies. But something nagged at her. She grabbed her phone and called the only person who'd understand. "Grandpa? I need advice." The next morning, the CEO's phone buzzed as his limo pulled up to Sunny's corner again. A text from an unknown number. "I'll take the job. On one condition." He smiled, until he read the next line. "You spend one shift working beside me first." The CEO stared at his phone, rereading the text. Work a shift beside her? He hadn't waited tables in 20 years. But if this was her condition. He typed back, "Tomorrow. 6 a.m. Before sunrise, the waitress arrived at the diner to find the CEO already waiting outside, wearing the same worn-out clothes from his disguise. "You're serious about this," she said, unlocking the door. "I don't make offers I won't honor," he replied. Inside, she tossed him an apron. Rule 1, no suits. Rule 2, no special treatment. He caught it, hesitating. "Shouldn't I shadow you first?" She lit the griddle with a whoosh of flames. "Best way to learn is to burn your fingers." The first hour was chaos. He spilled coffee reaching across a booth. Mixed up 2 orders. Dropped a plate of eggs, the crash making everyone turn. "Table 4 needs a remake," the waitress called calmly, already sweeping up the mess. His face burned. "I'll pay for that." She shook her head. "You don't pay here. You learn." By mid-morning, his dress shoes were killing him. His lower back ached. And the cook kept glaring every time he slowed down the ticket line. During a rare lull, he leaned against the counter, wiping sweat from his forehead. "How do you do this every day?" The waitress refilled his water. "Same way you run companies, one problem at a time." A customer waved impatiently. Before he could react, she was already there, diffusing the complaint with a smile and a free slice of pie. Watching her, the CEO felt something unexpected, respect, deeper than any boardroom had ever earned. Then came the real test. A group of teenagers left without paying. He started after them. "Let them go," she said quietly. "But maybe they're hungry. Maybe they're scared." She wiped the table. Today's loss might be tomorrow's loyal customer. He froze. That made terrible business sense. But human sense? Suddenly, his $1 million training program seemed hollow. As they closed up, blisters forming on his feet, the waitress handed him a wad of cash, his share of the tips. He tried to refuse. "You earned this." "So did you." She nodded at the cook, now nodding at him with grudging approval. "You lasted the whole shift." "Most don't." The CEO looked down at the crumpled bills, barely enough for a parking spot at his office. But it felt heavier than any paycheck. The CEO sat in his parked car outside the diner, staring at his blistered hands. 12 hours ago, they'd signed billion-dollar deals. Now they ached from carrying trays and scrubbing syrup off tables. His phone buzzed, an urgent board meeting reminder. He silenced it. There were more important things to think about. Inside the diner, the waitress counted the day's earnings while the cook wiped down the grill. "You really gonna work for that suit?" he grunted. She stacked the bills neatly. "Don't know yet." The truth was, she'd expected the CEO to quit by lunch. But he hadn't. And that changed things. The next morning, the CEO arrived at his corporate office looking unlike himself, no tie, slightly sunburned, and moving stiffly from yesterday's work. His assistant gaped. "Sir, are you? Call an all-hands meeting. Every manager. Every location." He set a grease-stained notepad on the desk. "And cancel the new customer service training program. But we paid consultants. We're doing it her way now." 2 days later, the waitress got a package, thick cardstock with gold foil lettering. Official offer letter. Salary box, $92,000 per year. Her knees nearly buckled. That was more than 3 years' rent. But the sticky note stuck to it caught her eye. "Offer stands. But I need you to see something first." An address for his flagship restaurant. Tonight. She arrived to find the place half-empty despite prime dinner time. Fancy decor, stiff servers, and a general iciness. The CEO waved her over to a corner booth where a well-dressed couple was complaining. "And the audacity to charge $18 for this," the woman hissed, pushing away a salad. The server's smile looked painful. "I'll inform the chef." The waitress watched, understanding dawning. These employees weren't rude. They were terrified. After closing, the CEO sat across from her at an empty table. "See the problem?" He gestured at the silent kitchen. "We teach rules, not judgment. Scripts, not empathy." She spun her coffee cup. "So you want me to, what? Fix this?" "No." He leaned forward. "I want you to teach me how to fix it." The waitress sat in silence as the CEO's words hung between them. Teach him? She was just a diner waitress. What did she know about fixing a corporate empire? But then she remembered the terrified server, the wasted food, the empty tables. She took a deep breath. "Okay," she said. "But we do it my way." 1 week later, every Urban Eats regional manager received a shocking email. Mandatory training, Sonny's Corner Diner. 5 a.m. Dress code, non-slip shoes. The outrage was instant. At 4:45 a.m., the waitress stood outside the diner with the CEO, watching as luxury cars pulled up one by one. A woman in a fur coat rolled down her window. "You can't be serious." The CEO crossed his arms. "Clock in or clear out your desk." Grumbling, the managers filed inside, where the cook slammed down a stack of aprons. "Welcome to hell," he grinned. The breakfast rush was a disaster. A VP spilled hot coffee on a customer's lap. A marketing director cried when a table yelled at her. The CFO kept checking his Rolex like it might save him. Through it all, the waitress moved calmly, demonstrating how to balance 3 plates, how to soothe angry guests, when to comp a meal. One manager snapped. "This is humiliating." She didn't look up from wiping a table. Good. By lunch, something unexpected happened. The CFO, who'd earlier refused to touch common ketchup bottles, was patiently teaching the VP how to wrap silverware. The marketing director, makeup smeared, laughed with a regular about her mistakes. The CEO watched, stunned, as his stiff, polished leaders connected. That night, as the exhausted managers left, the waitress pulled the CEO aside. "Your problem isn't training," she said quietly. "It's distance." He frowned. "Meaning?" You don't know hunger. They don't know shame. She nodded at the dish pit, where the cook was scraping burnt toast off pans. Until today. 3 months later, the CEO stood in the newly renovated lobby of Urban Eats' flagship location. The air smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread, but the real change was in the atmosphere. Servers chatted easily with customers. A line cook dashed out to hand a free muffin to a crying child. The place hummed with genuine warmth. Yet his eyes kept drifting to the door. Would she come? Meanwhile, at Sunny's corner, the waitress tied her apron for the last time. The cook leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Still think you're making a mistake, he grumbled. She smoothed the folded letter in her pocket, the one offering her not just a trainer position, but partnership in a new community kitchen initiative. Gotta try, she said softly. The bell jingled as she walked out. Urban Eats staff erupted in cheers when she entered. The CEO barely had time to extend his hand before she was swarmed by former executives, now proudly wearing server aprons, showing off what they'd learned. The CFO thrust out his phone. Look! Our customer satisfaction scores are meaningless, the waitress interrupted. Everyone froze. She stepped forward, addressing the room. Numbers don't feed people. You do. A beat. So. Who's hungry? Epilogue. The diner cook took over Sunny's corner with a silent investor, hint, it's the CEO. Urban Eats' Second Chance program now hires from shelters. And every new corporate hire? They still start with one 5 a.m. shift at a tiny diner.